Wastechishli, Gerald Hill ni yung gwats, osluni geha, kahun hadari ni yung gyats, hungwetne. I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to talk about the Native American Language Act. I'm also going to talk about the history of federal legislation, and I'm also going to talk about the history of Indians and the government in general, because we're coming down to this Native American Language Act, which is up for renewal, and it's passed the Senate, it's in the House. We hope it will pass there, probably will, but then it goes up to the President's office, who doesn't have a really strong support for Indians. And I think that whether or not that gets passed is part of the reality that we have to face, even when we have these kinds of initiatives where we're supporting immersion and immersion schools and teachers who do this. I think it's important to remember that we're looking to the government that undermined the languages in the first place. And we're looking to the government who took the land as a matter of policy. And we're looking to the government whose policy was the cavalry for many, many years. And now we supposedly have a different relationship and they're doing things for us. But I want to really bring that perspective of the various policies of the United States through its government have really wreaked havoc on our communities. And by being here, you're really representative of that interest that doesn't give up and doesn't buy into it, and you're still working on it to maintain the connection. And as a lawyer, as a judge, I look to the analysis of the origin of the power that the United States has over Indian people and Indian governments. And as one of my law professors told me, long ago, he says, the reason you Indians have to understand the law is because we have more tanks, and that's the truth. And the things that they're doing now show that with the so-called emergency on the border. Those people are Indian people that they're keeping out of the United States because they think they own it. And they're pulling out the troops and they're doing these terrible things to families and children. That's still the government, and that's still the government that we're looking to for support. So I really don't want to give the message that we should not access the resources that may become available or the resources that are available. I think that we should use them. And in my own head, I always say, I'll do the dance because I have to. Like I pay taxes because I have to. And the consequences that go with those kinds of enforcement mechanisms. But I don't drink the Kool-Aid, and I don't buy it, and I don't buy the logic that they have power over us, because one of the things that you're doing here now is asserting the independent self-knowledge of who you are. It's one of the things that the government can't take away and can't say, we gave you your sovereignty. They didn't give us nothing. The only reason you're here and why you know who you are is because you know who you are in your language and in your community. That's what I said in the beginning. I said, my name in English is Gerald Hill. My name in Oneida is Kahun Hadari. And when they say, how do you say that in English? And I said, well, you don't say it in English, you say it in Oneida. And you know, that's what we're talking about. And I think that each of you and each of your communities are identified in that way. You could ask yourself, and I've talked with relatives and other people at home to say, what makes you think you're Oneida? Or what makes you think you're Hopi? Or what makes you think you're some other community? And it's because you know. It's way down deep, even the sleaziest. So I think, you know, like when we're doing this, I remind my colleagues, other attorneys and organizations I belong to, that when we're talking about sovereignty, we're really talking about why the people know who they are and why the federal government has such a hard time dealing with us because we keep bringing up sovereignty. And to me, sovereignty means self-knowledge of who you are. Why do the states compact with us so that we can have casinos? Because they don't know how to deal with sovereignty. We know how to deal with it, and we demand to be listened to, and we'll write our agreements in your language so that you understand your obligation to us so that we can have these resources to do the things that we do. We educate people, we educate our own, we raise our standards of living phenomenally over the last 20 years because of that. There's places, including New Mexico, where the state government is very resistant and wants to get into more of the money because they need the money just like we need the money. We're reliant on it for the development. But still, it represents an order that they have to deal with us, and they have to write those things down. So when we look at the history, we could see some of the ways that it's evolved so that we start, with the Constitution, in which you would see a evolving attitude towards Indians. I mean, in the first place, they didn't have a policy that said you can't speak your language. They had a policy that said, let's make friends with the Indians so that we can take their land more easily. And they did. But they weren't arguing about not speaking your language. Now we've come all the way down to, why don't they want you to speak your language? They'll even give you chicken feed, so that you scurry around to try and do it. And I don't think that's the success of the programs that have worked. I think that's the success of the people who have maintained a strong idea and identity about who they are and about how important the languages are. And we want our languages, and we're fighting to keep them. And we can do it with the resources of the government, but the biggest resource of all is first language speakers. And the second biggest resource is people that want it and are willing to put out the effort to understand it and finally catch on to the intellectual promises and emotional depth of the language to understand. People were talking about the most profound things of life. Sometimes I'm critical of the things that we learned. We talk about our language as if they're, everything was really great. And I said, well, like we have other words. We have words for liars and sneaks and treacherous people and troublemakers and all these negative words because they existed. People were acting like that. And it's part of human nature that people would act out selfishly or jealously or for some other reasons to, I guess, steer the communities. And, there's always this kind of a balance of the good words versus the other words. And as I began to learn and understand my language, then I became acquainted with this term called the good words, or the words that we say before we say anything. Not just a prayer, but more like a thanksgiving for all the stuff around us. And we thank everything. We thank the stars in the sky and down to the earth and to the animals and to the water and to the fishes and to the wind and to the grandmas and to the brothers that protect us and to the stars and to the things that are so abstract that you can't even really talk about them, as if we would say, in part of our words, we'd say, that's something like, there's 4 things you have to learn and nobody can tell you what they are. You have to figure it out. Nobody gives you those things. You have to get inside, observe the life around you, observe your family, observe your community, and those things, whatever they are, will come to you. You have to work for them. And you can't even give them away. Whatever I know kind of surfacely, and I can share that, but I can't tell you those things that really move me, that make me want to do things, that make me care, that make me love my family, my community, that make me care about my language and my culture. I can't talk about them very good because they're personal, and they're so personal that I think there's things like this in any culture that says you have to get committed to whatever it is you're doing so that you know why you're doing it. I mean, I heard my nephews, my sister passed away last month, and they live in the city, and they're glad to see me because I'm now the oldest guy in the family, and which is kind of weird, you know, because, you know, like as you go on, you start kind of like moving up in age until, you know, sometimes you're the oldest one. So I achieved the status of oldest one, and I said, you know, I really don't feel much different than I did when I was, you know, one of everybody. But I know things, I learned things, and one of my nephews said, you know, I really like to learn our language. And I knew that he didn't know what that meant. But he was interested. And I thought, you know, like to go from having that kind of a dabbling interest to actually getting into the repetition and finding out and working on it and the drive to learn what certain things meant. I think that was, you know, part of something that I could listen to, but I didn't want to respond to. I didn't want to say, well, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. You know how long it takes to learn a language, blah, blah, blah. I have a degree in linguistics, and I'm aware of a lot of the studies that say you need this many hours and this kind of time to become fluent. And, you know, I'm thinking, we don't even know what fluent is. You know, what is fluent? Fluent is, you know, the ability to freely express and comprehend what's going on. And I would say, like, if anybody knew what I said in Oneida, they might be surprised how little I know. But people that don't know think it's a lot. Well, it is a lot for me, and I'm proud of it. And it took a long time to get to that position where I would feel free and comfortable in doing something like that. So I think that rather than dumping on anybody's dreams and ideas and ambition and things like that, that I would be more encouraging. And I said, well, come on out, you know, and come on over, you know, and spend some time, and we can talk about what you mean when you say, I really like to learn my language one of these days. And there's a lot that goes to that, and, you know, we know it, and you know it as teachers. I'm glad my preceding speakers greeted the women. And as I look around here, men are very underrepresented. And that's probably good. You know, so many things I see on Facebook that say the women, when the women take over, things will change. And I'll write back and say, well, I wish you'd hurry up, you know. But I think it's true. I mean, there's, you know, there's that connection and that understanding of the roles we have in our community that have to do with our gender. And those are the kind of things that we would learn in our culture that would explain those things that we need to understand. And I think that those are the things that reinforce our identity and how we think and how we belong. And one of the biggest things for me, and it's still a hard thing, is to go into our language and begin to think that different way. And bilingual people just, you know, they flip back and forth, but people that are going from a reinforcement of one language to the other, you're still always thinking in English when you're trying to say some words in your language. And I think that that's where the work starts, when you start having that feeling of, this is how the language goes together. This is how we say certain things. This is how, when we hear somebody who's really proficient in language. It's very beautiful. You can't teach that. That has to come from the person. So even in the old days, they would say, well, there's people that know it, and then there's people that do it. And when you know it, you can talk all about it. When you do it, it's the way you live, and the way you think, and how you communicate. Okay, I want to jump back again now to the United States Constitution was passed in 1790. And in 1790, one of the first things that the new Congress did was pass the Indian Non-Intercourse Act, which we've had a lot of fun with that phrase. But the meaning of it legally was that only the federal government could deal with Indians directly. The states couldn't. And so a lot of the fights you see that go on even today have to do with federal rights versus state rights, whether it's voting, whether it's voter registration, a lot of different things. The other things that we talk about are like things that go across the United States, like interstate type of activities. It could be transportation. It could be a number of different things. But part of what sovereignty means is that we still deal with the government directly. Sometimes we have to deal with the states, like, Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. We compact with the states to jointly regulate these activities. But there's some really brilliant Indians around who made sure that we still stay in charge of that, so that this independent generation of leaders was able to save something so that we could independently generate money, resources that we couldn't do as the states do through taxation. And that's one of the things that we would give back to the federal government, saying that even though we would have the power to tax, taxation is kind of a dirty word in Indian country, because it implies enforcement. And enforcement, kind of gets you back to the bigger tanks, or tanks at all, the cops or anybody that could enforce some order. So these states' rights issues have continued to exist, and even in the Supreme Court this past session, there was 4 cases that had to do with various treaty rights and things of that nature, and the biggest one was out of Oklahoma, which seemed to say that, I don't know if it's the Choctaws or whoever they are, own half of the state. And of course, that really put the non-Indians that live there in a terrible frame of mind. And the Supreme Court ducked it. They didn't decide it. They decided to extend that into the next session. And hopefully, from a conservative point of view, maybe one or more of the older progressive justices would die, and the orange guy could appoint somebody else that he thinks would be more favorable. Well, that doesn't always work out, but it's kind of one of the things of how that government works and how they think. But it also points out that Indians, which are a very small percentage of the population, probably less than 1%, are able to generate issues that go up to the highest court, and they're still talking about treaties. Treaties, that was the way that the federal government dealt with Indians at the time, and they did that until 1821 or 1871, in which the number of states had increased to a point where they had been able to do away with the treaty making with Indians. And now it comes down to federal legislation. The modern cases are about treaty rights. And treaty rights under the Constitution are referred to as the law of the land, the same as if they were passed through Congress. They could do that. And that's one of the things that the politicians started to catch on to, is that we need to break that. We need to break that communication. And they've been doing it ever since. One of the big ones was the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. And another was Indian Citizenship of 1924, which I seen on Facebook, somebody says, they gave us the right to be citizens. And I'm thinking, you don't know the history of that. Because citizenship was a dirty word. That meant that you became an American and you quit being, your own nation. That's what that was about. And by the way, they could also tax you and they could also draft you. And I think those were things that people misunderstand and need to be informed about, that they didn't give you no favors. That was part of an attempt to assimilate the tribal governments and undermine them. The Indian Reorganization Act was another one. 1934, they made I shouldn't say that. They encouraged and put the position of becoming this type of a government for purposes of the United States administration of services to communities into one of these 4 types of government. But they were just councils. And there were councils to keep track of how many of you there are. There were councils to oversee membership, which is again counting. There was land assignments and things of that nature. And that was another one, and a lot of tribes have shucked it off, and including our own, which recited the authority of the United States or the Secretary of Interior to approve all the decisions that we made, whether it was membership, whether it was land assignments, no matter what it was. They had that oversight. Now, I'm a judge, and we changed our Constitution to provide for an independent court system, a judiciary. And we made our qualifications very high to be that, and we made it so that we don't have to have outside lawyers come in and do it. We do it ourselves. And somebody asked me, they said, well, why would you want to do that? And I says, we have to do that. That's sovereignty. We take care of ourselves. If we can't make our own decisions about ourselves, including hard decisions. Unfortunately, some of those hard decisions have to do with family law. They have to do with divorces, busting up families, awarding custody, assigning child support, things of that nature, which are not really very popular with the people that are engaged in that. But it's an important thing for us to do. We're keeping order. I think that Indian people are lawful people. We want to know what the law is. We want to know who made the law. We want to know why we have to accede to the law. So when we talk of ourselves as, I want to say law people, but more like we want to obey the law, but we need to know what the law is, and we need to know who makes it. The first governments were Code of Federal Regulations, which means exactly what they imply, is that Congress decided what the law was. Drinking, fighting, ordinance type of peacekeeping law. They didn't talk about civil law. They didn't talk about who could grant divorces. They didn't talk about who could be arrested or punished. And when they did away with treaties, they also did away with the recognition that the tribe would address its own bad guys, and that we would recognize the outside authority as recognizing theirs. They took that away, and we had to go for it, unfortunately. The BIA police was from the BIA. It wasn't from the community. And so that kind of wipes out the authority or the purpose of warriors to keep peace in the community and to protect the community. So now that started coming from the outside. Now we drifted into this, and we're talking about the 20s, less than 100 years ago, where the policy was no longer to kill the Indians, but it was still to steal the land. And so they did what they call Public Law 250. This was under Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was a very grandfatherly looking old guy. He was a war hero. But he signed these laws that said that we will terminate our responsibility for Indians. That wasn't just ending the treaty, that was ending everything. And we will relocate these Indians into cities. So we have big cities with huge urban Indian populations, and fortunately they go back and forth, but there's still a huge presence of urban Indians. And now, like my sister's kids, they're all city people, and when they come back, they've missed a lot of stuff, but they're still connected. So we have to figure out ways to include them. By the 1970s, we're doing things like the federal government under the Great Society passing PL 638, and that allowed the tribes to begin to run programs that had been previously run by the federal government. It also became the first time that the tribes became direct employers over all the people that served them and provided them those services. Around the same time, they had the Indian Civil Rights Act, and that was to outline what tribes were obliged to recognize as the rights of individuals. Now we're coming to a time when the right of individuals becomes more important than the right of the community. So people begin to think like that, and I think that right now we're in a state where individualism is much more important than communalism, because we can't agree communally, but individually we can stand up and make speeches and make demands and attempt to speak for the people without being installed with some kind of limit to being able to speak. So when I hear the term Indian leaders, I take it with a grain of salt, because as I understand our Indian leaders, they were not leaders in the sense of I decide and it goes from the top down. They were spokesmen. That means you speak for the community. You don't speak for yourself. That becomes an important quality in the people that speak for you, because you're never speaking for yourself, you're speaking for the people. And what you hear and what you bring back is left for wiser heads to determine what that really means. So you're like a recording device. You say what they told you to say, and you bring back what you heard. And I think that that's something that is more communal oriented than it is for people that call themselves leaders. And it really hurts my feelings, and I don't say anything about it, but when I hear a young kid, who hasn't been anyplace or done anything, say, us Indian leaders, and I'm thinking, oh God, you don't know. That's like people that never go to war that talk about veterans and fighting and battles and that kind of stuff. I says, people that really did that don't like to talk about it, because it's terrible. I mean, you kill people. You do those kinds of things. You don't do that lightly. And when you have to talk about it, you don't talk about it. It's not something to talk about. But we love our veterans if they'll just come out, put on their uniforms, do a photo op, and march out during the powwow and stuff like that. But what about the guy that has PSTD, or did I say it right? PSTD. Yeah, I mean, guys are just, they used to call it shell shock. They just are so terribly affected by the things they've seen and maybe things they had to do. We don't take care of them. They become homeless. They become suicidal. We don't want those guys in the photo op. We want those other guys with the bright uniforms and carrying the flags, and the politicians standing up with them and that kind of stuff. And I think that those are the kind of things that make you mad. Indian Child Welfare Act, they're fighting that one. They passed that about 50 years ago so that tribes would be able to reclaim children that had been fostered away to non-Indian homes, or termination of parental rights that made the children be raised in some other culture. And it's really heartbreaking. I know we had when that first came out, I had a case in which we went to town to explain to the local government in middle Wisconsin, which is really kind of hillbilly country, about the Indian Child Welfare Act that they knew nothing about and didn't really care about. They thought that was another thing that was a bunch of bull, and they didn't see why they had to do it. And the case they had was a young girl that had been adopted or fostered by this young Christian family. And she was part of the family. I mean, they're all lily white and she's the brown one, but they loved her and they cared about her. And everybody showed up. And what we had was a mother who had abandoned her and a grandmother that didn't really have the strength to demand her back, and we were demanding her back on behalf of the tribe, meaning we would take her from that family and put her in an Oneida family that we hadn't really identified yet. I mean, that sounds so cruel. Could we do that? Well, in the end, we couldn't do that. But the parents agreed that they would bring her out to the community and let her know her birth parents and her birth family. And it was a kind of a compromise that, oh, I didn't want to do that, but I had to, because the disruption of a child couldn't be countenanced by just taking them away from a loving family and then bringing them to somebody they didn't know that we hadn't even identified yet. I mean, you know, like the reversal of what's going on down on the southwestern border where they're ripping off kids and putting them in, you know, jails and detentions and cages and things like that. And it's inhumane. There's nothing about love and affection and taking care of young children that we had to face. So we had to act against our impulse of what the law said about, you know, we have a right to demand this and we could take this all the way up and make it an issue. But what would it do to that kid? What would it do to that family? What would it say about us as the kind of people who are willing to abide the strict words of the law against the humane issues that were involved of ripping people that loved each other away from each other? Those are the kind of things that we had to take on, and now they're fighting that, and there's a lot of things about it that people are up in arms about. One of the good things was the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which I think that nobody understood at the time enough to say that this would give us such an advantage as it would change Indian country. And we wouldn't be here in this hotel and this conference center and all the other places we get to go to if it hadn't been for something like that, that people knew what it meant and took advantage and built on it and diversified from it. And I would say a lot of reason a lot of us are here are because we were educated, because of the doors that were opened by that, and all the education that's going on now. Now, I'll get to the Native American Regulatory Act. As a former street activist, I'm really cynical about the federal government doing anything for us other than take our land, make us assimilate, and take away whatever rights that we presently exercise now. And I think that by doing this and what Francis was saying, we're taking advantage of opportunities and we're doing the dance we have to do, but we're not buying, or we're not drinking the Kool-Aid. We're not buying all the reasoning that you're doing this for your own good. What happens is that you have people, politicians, who have very little knowledge about language or culture making decisions about language and culture. That's terrible. It goes right down to the communities where we have administrators that are non-Indians, and as much empathy as they may have, still are not part of the solution because they don't have the necessary feelings that make them have to live by the things that they're doing. And I think that you can say under education, that's a good thing for them to do, and a lot of them are very good people and trying to help, but you got a lot of people in there that are just career bureaucrats who do nothing except get in the way. And I think that those are the kind of things that we have to put up with and work around. And I think that, as I would say, the Native American Languages Act was first created in 1990 after many, many years of assimilative policies and education and that, and now they care. But by 1990, there were so many communities that had lost so many first language speakers that the critical mass of speakers was below a healthy level. And we call that, the moribund languages. That means like you still got some speakers, but they're all dying off and they're all old, and that's the place we find ourselves now. So that's not hopeless, though. That's a reality that says we understand what we're working against, and we understand how to preserve the most precious of our resources, which is speakers. So I always encourage people, I said, well, whatever you know, say it. Even if it's a couple words, say it. When my grandchildren call me Laksot, that makes me feel good. They're describing relationship between me and them. And they also know that their other Laksot is also Laksot, so they're understanding the concept of grandparentage, but in our language. And they also understand Aksot, which is their grandmas, and so on down. So to use that as much as possible, I don't really try to give them lessons, I try to talk to them. And I know what they get in school. They get numbers, colors, animals, things. That's good, but I like to think that I take it a little bit further. I want them to be able to say 2 dogs, or 3 dogs, or brown dogs, or black dogs, or bad dogs, and things like that, so that we begin to add some contour to the things that they're learning. And so instead of saying, that's no good and don't do it that way, I'm saying, that's good. Do it that way. Now let's use it. And I don't say we're going to have a lesson on Tuesday. I say, would somebody come and help me color these books that I just bought down at the All Indian Cultural? And I get the pencils out and I says, I'm not asking you to learn anything. I'm just asking you to help me color these pictures. And we can talk about the colors, and we can talk about the animals, we can talk about the people, and the things that come out in those line drawings and the stories that go with them. They like that. I like it too. Coloring is very therapeutic, but the conversation that goes with it is even more therapeutic. So I really will close and say that I encourage you to read this new act, to watch it, to ask your leaders to watch it and to support it as much as possible. It isn't the answer, but it's some help. And so we have to look at things like that there's a lot of things that are not the total answer, but there's something that's positive that you can work on. So I will say, Dane Tonio lewa galiwat gweniji natian galiwa and dakwa. Nene skaliwat skanahwedmat nuduni, to negawanak. I said, that's as far as I can go. And if I said anything that you don't agree with, well, that's okay. We can have a discussion about it. And if you want to argue with me, well, we can, lunchtime, go argue. If you're interested in discussing more of, anything I said or what my colleague has said before me, we should do that. We should keep talking. So thank you very much.